When installing the compressor into the machine compartment, the first step is to attach the 4 rubber boots to the feet of the compressor. Do so by compressing the boot, sliding it into the channel of the foot, and locking it into place. Four metal tabs on the base pan go into the holes in the middle of the boot of the compressor. And install the cotter pins back into the holes on the tabs. You may need to apply downward pressure on the washer to make room for the cotter pins. Now that the compressor is securely in place, move on to depressurizing and rebrazing the compressor into the system. After the compressor has been depressurized, reinsert the discharge line into the discharge port of the compressor. You can reuse the Schrader port service valve or construct a new one. Lastly, reattach the suction lines to the suction port of the compressor. Wrap the compressor with wet rags. The discharge line has a thermal overload. If overload is activated, this will prevent refrigerant flow from the compressor. After sufficiently wrapping the compressor, use a torch to focus on heating the braze joint. Spend no longer than 20 seconds on each braze joint and point the flame away from the compressor to avoid possible overheating. Allow the pipes to cool naturally. To reattach the hot gas tube, braze the hot gas loop to the hot gas return line that runs through the drain pan. To reattach the wire harness to the unit, a series of 3 or 5 prong plugs need to be attached to the molded outlets on the underside of the machine compartment. Next, reinstall the drain tube. Insert the tube through the holding features of the drain pan, guiding the drain tube onto the drain of the evaporator pan. Then install permagum around the joining point of the drain pan and drain tube. From there, take the DC driver for the condenser fan and reattach it to the condenser fan lead. Then, pass the DC driver toward the front of the cabinet in the machine compartment. The last step is to attach the ground wire of the main power plug to the underside of the cabinet to the right side of the fill hole. Do so using a zinc pan head machine screw and a small screwdriver. Tighten fully to the riv nut installed for the ground wire. To insert a new LNS line, feed the cap tube through the hole of the piping egress in the back of the cabinet. Start by feeding the cap tube in at about a 45-degree angle so you do not come in contact with the base pan on the machine compartment. To fully feed the LNS line, apply a slight bend and allow it to come straight down through the piping egress. Slowly work it, being careful not to overbend the copper tubing. Continue to do so until the tubing lines up with the evaporator on the inside of the cabinet. The next step is to reattach the LNS line to the evaporator. First, put a coil in the cap tube to be inserted into the evaporator inlet. Do 2 wraps, which is about a 3/4 of an inch, and remove the caps. Insert the coiled length of the cap tube into the evaporator inlet. Insert the suction line of the LNS line into the evaporator outlet. Apply a wet rag behind the tubing of the evaporator inlet and outlet. There are 3 joints to braze. Also, apply a wet rag over the face of the evaporator. Begin heating the joints to be brazed. First, braze the evaporator inlet. Second, the cap tube inlet. And third, the evaporator outlet. Allow the brazed joints to cool. When assembling the dryer, insert the provided service line into the dryer. Remove the core of the Schrader valve and insert that into the process tube. Now braze the tube to the dryer. Wrap the dryer with a wet rag to reduce carbon buildup inside the dryer. Heat the bulb of the dryer, focusing on the points that will be brazed. Then, move up and braze the Schrader port process tube. Allow the brazed joints to cool. The next step is to wrap the compressor with a wet rag, attach the dryer assembly to the condenser outlet line, and braze it into place. Once again, the dryer is wrapped to reduce buildup of carbon during the brazing process. When the braze is complete, allow it to cool. Check the point between the two ports to ensure there is a complete bead of solder there. To bend the L&S line to the process port of the compressor, bend the smooth radius that meets the process port on the compressor. To roll the cap tube, bend a 180-degree bend into the cap tube, leaving a 1/4 inch length past the roller. Move the roller down and begin coiling the cap tube until it meets the coil of the suction line. Adjust the level of the cap tube by coiling the unbent end around the roller. The goal is for the coil of the cap tube to rest at the end of the coil of the suction line. Apply a 45-degree downward bend, a 1/2 inch length from the tip of the cap. This will encompass both the cap tube insertion depth and ensure the cap tube pulls liquid refrigerant from the dryer. Insert the cap tube into the dryer and braze it in place. Once again, the dryer is wrapped to reduce buildup of carbon during the brazing process. Use the braze sparingly to reduce the chance of restricting the cap tube inside the dryer. Allow braze to cool naturally. With the compressor wrapped in wet rags to ensure no wires will be scorched during the brazing process, you can now braze the suction line. Allow the pipes to cool naturally. To close the piping egress, first wrap the wires with the provided Armaflex ring. Take the split grommet, open it around the wires and the L&S line, and push it into the opening. Then insert permagum into the egress to ensure a firm seal against infiltration from the machine compartment. Then take a slightly larger piece of permagum and wrap both the L&S line and the wires to form an airtight seal. To permagum the interior egress of the cabinet, repeat a similar process to the machine compartment egress. Install permagum down into the egress around the entire circumference at the opening and apply a finishing piece to ensure an airtight seal. Before installing the back panel, reattach the temperature probe that goes from the controller to the evaporator outlet. Using a zip tie, position the probe near the top of the pipe and tighten it to ensure good thermal contact. Trim the excess with a side cutter. To install the inverter, connect the associated wires from the wire harness to the corresponding leads. Place inverter into the machine compartment next to the compressor. To connect the inverter to the compressor, slide the tab at the back of the compressor into this inverter feature. The male 3-prong plug on the compressor will fit into the female 3-prong plug of the inverter. Do so by moving the inverter back toward the doghouse of the cabinet, inserting the tab, pulling. The final step to install the inverter is to put the provided screw into the slot of the compressor and the inverter. Lastly, use a bond screw to install the ground wire to the riv nut in the top of the machine compartment. When charging the unit, isolate the vacuum pump on the manifold, isolating the charging hose and the hose connected to the unit. Hook up the charging canister and charge to the level referenced on the unit's nameplate, making sure to use the grounding strap. When charging is complete, isolate the unit from the manifold and remove the gauges. Replace the Schrader cap.